I have finally solved the mystery of Atlantis after 3,000 years of confusion. Once you realized that the ancient Greeks had not explored the Western Sahara, including the Eye of the Sahara, and that Atlantis was described as a continent-sized island outside the Strait of Gibraltar that faced modern-day Spain and mysteriously sunk into the sea, all the other pieces of evidence, like elephants and mountains and monsoons, all start coming together. I will be putting all of the Atlantis information you will ever need into this one video, including the full text of the original story. And if you watch the whole thing, you will finally understand the message that was passed down through the ancient Egyptians, Solon, and Plato, and eventually us in 2025. And don't leave any angry comments in the comments section until you've watched the full video, because I think the evidence will really change a lot of minds. Now, before we get into the evidence, we should address the theory that Atlantis was not an Egyptian myth, and that it was actually completely fabricated by Plato. Now, this is an odd argument because in Plato's other dialogues, like the Apology, where Socrates is sentenced to death, his words are taken at face value. Next, for Plato's other apparently made-up myths, in his dialogues like the Republic, he doesn't give a specific source like Solon or Egyptian priests, and he makes it very clear that he's using a parable. In this dialogue, however, Critias gives several very long explanations about where Solon got the information and how he translated it, which would be totally unnecessary if the story was actually fabricated by Plato. There's simply no reason for Plato to lie about this for a story that he created himself and he could take the credit for. Solon's Egyptian priest stories are also very similar to Herodotus, who visited the Egyptian priests 100 years later and whose stories are also taken as fact. We also don't have any first-hand evidence of Solon's actual writing, and we mostly rely on second accounts from people like Aristotle, which again are totally accepted by the mainstream and not assumed to be created by the second-hand author. And when you consider that Critias was also a very famous student of Socrates at the same time as Plato, it becomes very unlikely that he would totally fabricate his words in his dialogue. Now, while the discussion of Atlantis in Critias is likely real and not made up by Plato, the story itself is clearly mythological. And in fact, the god Poseidon plays a very central role in the story. So, unless you're a religious follower of Greek mythology, you shouldn't take the entire story literally. However, we should be open-minded to learn from mythological texts, just like they do for the Bible or the Quran or other ancient texts. We should also consider that it's also very likely that Solon, Critias, and Plato made changes to the original Egyptian story, and there's even evidence of this when Critias is talking about Solon, when he was saying that Solon was planning to use the story of Atlantis in one of his poems. Now, on the other side of this issue, we also have all of the different crackpot Atlantis theories, which are usually just random underwater locations, and as I will show later in this video, don't come anywhere close to matching Solon's original description of Atlantis. And this is how I could tell very few people have actually gone through the original text, because the actual story gives very specific dimensions matching the Eye of the Sahara and description of great mountains and elephants, and also describes the region as the same size as North Africa. And so this very suspiciously resembles the unexplored Western Sahara and sub-Saharan Africa at that time, not random small islands in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. When you hear the entire original story today, you will realize that, just like all the rest of our ancient history, Atlantis is a combination of myth and facts that can teach us an incredible amount about our ancient past, especially during the Cretaceous period and the Ice Age. Now remember, most of our ancient history before the ancient Greeks has been completely lost due to events like the burning of the Library of Alexandria and other religious purges over the many years. For example, we are lacking primary evidence for how the ancient Egyptians efficiently quarried granite and moved it around and built the Great Pyramids. And we also don't know almost anything about the people who lived at Göbekli Tepe around 11,000 years ago. And also, almost all of our ancient history comes from one Greek guy named Herodotus. Sometimes we need to rely on exaggerated and mythological stories, which still contain serious historical truths. So, grab some popcorn, because we are going to be going line by line through the entire story, and discover the facts behind the seemingly mythological story of Atlantis. Now, the source text of Atlantis is the dialogue Critias, written by Plato. And at the start of the text, Critias and Socrates are beginning a conversation, and then most of it is just dominated by Critias telling the story. So when you see red text in this video, just assume that it's the words of Critias, unless I say otherwise. In the story, Critias claims to have found writings from Solon in which he's explaining the story of Atlantis as told to him by the Egyptian priests. Critias first says, "If I can recollect and recite enough of what was said by the priests and brought hither by Solon, I doubt not that I shall satisfy the requirements of this theater. And now, making no more excuses, I will proceed." And he starts the story like this. "Let me begin by observing, first of all, that 9,000 was the sum of years which had elapsed since the war which was said to have taken place between those who dwelt outside the pillars of Heracles and all who dwelt within them. This war I'm going to describe. Of the combatants on the one side, the city of Athens was reported to have been the leader and to have fought out the war. The combatants on the other side were commanded by the kings of Atlantis." Now, the pillars of Heracles, or Hercules, is simply the Straits of Gibraltar, and so right away we know that Atlantis was said to have been outside the Mediterranean area. And he continues like this. "Many great deluges have taken place during the 9,000 years, for that is the number of years which have elapsed since the time of which I am speaking. And during all this time, and through so many changes, there has never been any considerable accumulation of the soil coming down from the mountains, as in other places, but the earth has fallen away all around and sunk out of sight." Now, it's very interesting to hear this explanation of a lack of erosion, but this idea that all of the land was sinking into the ocean and out of sight. And this seems logical for them, but of course now we know that over this 9,000 year period, there was just a tremendous amount of sea level rise. So as you can see here, 9,000 years ago was actually the end of the Ice Age, and it's when sea levels started rising very dramatically. And now when he says there was many deluges over this period of time, the reason he's saying there's many is because at the time the Greeks only knew of one great deluge, and basically sinking into the sea, sort of like a rising of sea levels. But as we can see here, over the 9,000 years, it was a gradual process, and there was also these meltwater pulses, 1B and 1C, which were also very rapid periods of sea level rise. So during a few generations, people could witness over the course of their life something like 10 meters of sea level rise. And this would be totally dramatic and could completely wipe out entire cities and even what we consider countries today. Now, to give more credibility to the Egyptian priests, as described by Solon, we can look to the writings of Herodotus, which, like I said before, are generally accepted as historical fact. And Herodotus actually gave very similar descriptions of the Egyptian priest stories as did Solon, and he lived about 100 to 200 years after Solon. And so in this first example, he's explaining the origin story of the ancient Egyptians, and he mentions that there are 341 generations of men. And so he does a little bit of math, and it works out to 11,340 years, okay, from his time. And this is interesting because this would extend into the Green Sahara period and to 2,000 years before, according to Solon, the time that Atlantis was destroyed. Now, it's also interesting to note here is that he said what the Egyptian priest said was that during all that time, they had no king who was a god in human form. So this is just a little interesting fact about the pharaohs. Now, we have tons of these oral traditions of genealogies through religious texts and other historical texts, and this is actually a really good tool that we can use to determine how old things are. And a lot of times, there are some obviously mythological elements to these, like for how long people live when it came to the Sumerian list of kings and things like this. But there's still a lot of historical facts that we can learn from these genealogies, like the one that Herodotus mentioned. Now, the Egyptian priests also told Herodotus this very strange story where the ancient Egyptians originally thought they were the oldest people in the world, but then to find out, this king did an experiment where he raised two babies in isolation, and the first word that they spoke would decide which people were older. Okay, and the story goes that the first word that these kids spoke at around the age of 1 was a word from the Phrygians, who are the people who lived in what we know as Turkey today. Now, this is sort of either a really strange coincidence or some sort of mythological knowledge that's been passed down, because we know that the oldest civilization of humans on Earth that we found is at Göbekli Tepe, and this goes back 11,000 to 13,000 years old, which also coincidentally matches the time frame that Herodotus gave. And it's similar to the time frame that Solon gives for Atlantis as well. Now, Herodotus also mentioned a lot of other things that are very true about the ancient Egyptians, as we can see through primary sources through Egyptology. Now, first he mentions that the Egyptians were the first to come up with 12 months and 365 days per year. And he also mentions that the Egyptians were the first people to start using the 12 gods, and that the Greek gods were based on the Egyptian gods. Okay, he also says that the priests said that they were the first to engrave figures on stones, which is kind of interesting because we think this first happened in Sumeria. And then he also says, things they showed me by actual facts that they had happened so. So basically here he's saying that they showed proof for what they were saying. Now finally, they also told him that the first king of Egypt was Min, and that in his time all Egypt, except the district of Thebes, was a swamp, and none of the regions were then above water, which now lie below the lake of Moiris, to which lake it is a voyage of 7 days up the river from the sea. We recognize this as the Fayum oasis today, and what he said is really prescient and interesting. So when you look at an elevation map of Egypt, you can see that there are actually these major regions that are lower in elevation than that lake that he was talking about. And so during the time when the Green Sahara was happening, when there was much more water in the Nile and much more water in Egypt in general, these regions, he's saying, were underwater. Okay, and so this sort of dates the Old Kingdom to the Green Sahara period, or at least the end of the Green Sahara period. Now, what's interesting is that at the end of the Green Sahara period, this is when the sea levels had already stopped rising. And again, it's very interesting that he mentions that there were regions that were underwater before and not the other way around, because if the sea levels were much lower, for example, if they were 60 meters lower, the Egyptian priests would have mentioned this. And they would have said that at the time of Egypt's founding, that the sea level, or much of the land, had not sunk into the sea, like they said in Greece. And as you can see here, 5,000 years ago, which is 3100 BC, when the Old Kingdom was apparently founded, according to the mainstream, there was only less than 5 meters of sea level rise. Okay, so this is sort of giving credibility to the Egyptian priests and to Herodotus too, and in part to Solon. Now, what's also interesting is that around this time was sort of the peak in what some people would say for the ancient Egyptians in the Old Kingdom. And so only a couple hundred years after the founding of Egypt, they built the Great Pyramid of Giza and most of the other major pyramids. And we also know that the banks of the Nile were much higher at the site of Giza based on archaeology there. So we know through this that the ancient Egyptian priests that talked to Solon and Herodotus were very credible in their history, and he even says that they showed them proof. Now, back to the story. That was kind of a big sidetrack, but back to the story. Back to Critias, he says this: Atlantis, which, as I was saying, was an island greater in extent than Libya and Asia. Now, he didn't literally mean Libya and Asia, and at the time, Libya was meant as the entirety of North Africa, and Asia was sort of meant as Persia or Iran and just other parts of that region. So this is basically what the ancient Greeks understood as the world. They didn't know about Western Africa, and they didn't know about Sub-Saharan Africa. And this is really obvious because you can't even see the Horn of Africa on this map here. Now, there's a lot of confusion in some alternative circles where they say Atlantis on this map here, and this is based on Herodotus' work. But Atlantis was just a people that Herodotus was talking about who lived in the Atlas Mountains. Okay, so the Atlas Mountains are very far north of modern-day Mauritania and the Eye of the Sahara. Okay, so that's not exactly relevant to the Atlantis story, although it is a weird coincidence. The reason some people thought that Africa looked like this is what's called the Voyage of Necho. Okay, and this is a story of this Egyptian king who apparently had these Phoenicians sail all the way around Africa, and this is basically the result of that. However, even Herodotus doubts this story, in fact. Now, when we overlay this with what we know as Africa today, you can see that pretty much the entirety of the Western Sahara is totally missing. And of course, this contains Mauritania, where the Eye of the Sahara is located today. And you can also kind of tell that the Voyage of Necho was nonsense, or at least we can assume that, based on the Horn of Africa missing and the other obvious geographical features of Africa missing, okay? Unless they just did a voyage and didn't record anything properly, which is also possible, I suppose. Okay, but when they say in the story that it was sunk into the ocean, okay, and it was in that location that we see Western Sahara in today, the whole story of Atlantis really starts coming together. Now, there is some argument over, in the story of Atlantis, if the word island was translated correctly and if it actually meant island. However, considering that it's the size of a continent, and when you look at their map, they thought it was just water around northern Africa, you can see it just doesn't really matter, and that Atlantis was just considered a continent, and all continents are basically islands if you think about it. Okay, so moving on back to Critias, here he's explaining how Solon translated the story of Atlantis from the Egyptian priests, and he explains that he ended up using a lot of the Greek or what's called Hellenistic names for things when he translated it back. And so this sort of explains things like the use of Poseidon and Zeus at the end of the story and the other Greek gods. And it also kind of explains the reason for a lot of Greek influence that you might see in the story of Atlantis. Now, just in case you were wondering, both Solon and Herodotus probably did not speak the same language as the ancient Egyptian priests, and so they probably required translators. Okay, so this is just another source of potential errors, okay, in the translation. Okay, but anyway, back to the story. So based on what I said earlier, it's plausible to assume that the so-called island that was apparently continent-sized was basically just a description of West Africa. Okay, and when you see the details as we move forward, you'll see why this is. Okay, now back to the story. Critias says this: "And when afterwards sunk by an earthquake, became an impassable barrier of mud to voyagers sailing from hence to any part of the ocean." Now, this is really interesting because a barrier of mud and something like a mud flat is pretty much only something you see in fresh water, or something like a river and like a mud flat, just like I was saying. You never see something like this in the open ocean. Okay, so it's very strange. That would be a very strange way to describe an island in the Atlantic Ocean sinking and then for some reason turning into a mud flat. Okay, but when it comes to a giant pile of mud or a mud flat, that would be drying up all of the rivers and turning them into mud and preventing you from sailing from hence into the ocean, or from sailing from that continent into the ocean through a river. A great example would be something like the Sahara Desert drying up at the end of the Green Sahara period, or even partially drying up 11,000 years ago during the end of the story of Atlantis. Okay, now getting back into the story, Critias also gives this section explaining the climate change that happened in Greece over the 9,000 years. Because again, the story is about Greece and Atlantis. And I'm not going to read the whole thing because it has nothing to do with Atlantis, but his main point is that the climate of Greece used to be able to support things like large trees for lumber, and then all sorts of different types of food that the soil, because of its degradation over time, could no longer support. Now, this doesn't talk about Atlantis, so I'm not going to focus too much on this section, but I will say I got a comment in my last video from a guy who was talking about this part of the Critias, and he was mentioning that this was true, and these changes that they've seen in the climate of Greece over time, and that they had some evidence of this. Now, the origin story of Atlantis starts like this. Critias says, "I have before remarked in speaking of the allotments of the gods that they distributed the whole earth into portions differing in extent, and made for themselves temples and instituted sacrifices. And Poseidon, receiving for his lot the island of Atlantis, begat children by a mortal woman, and settled them in a part of the island which I will describe. Looking towards the sea, but in the center of the whole island, there was a plain which is said to have been the fairest of all plains and very fertile. Near the plain again, and also in the center of the island, at a distance of about 50 stadia, there was a mountain not very high on any side. Now, if we consider the Western Sahara as the island or the continent of Atlantis, there's a very flat desert right in the middle, and it's also directly adjacent to the Richat structure or Eye of the Sahara. And this is a flat desert right now, but during the Green Sahara, this would have been a fertile plain. Now, moving into the Richat structure or the Eye of the Sahara, we have another thing that matches up perfectly. And this is also in the center of the continent or island of Atlantis. Now, here he says, near the plain again, and in the center of the island, at a distance of about 50 stadia, there was a mountain not very high on any side. And you can see the mountain in the center of the Richat structure is barely even a mountain, and it's not very high on any side. It's much less than 100 meters in height. Okay, by the way, the unit of measurement that's used throughout the story is called the stadion or the stadium. And as you can guess, it's basically just a football field equivalent, or a bit longer, in about 200 meters or sometimes 150 meters. Okay, keep that in mind. Now, when we measure the distance from the mountain to the plain, this is one of the few measurements that could be a little off, depending on what you measure as the plain and what you measure as the mountain. But you can see here it's between around 50 to 150 stadia. Okay, here I just want to emphasize that during the Green Sahara period, or the African Humid Period, we would expect massive lakes all throughout what we know as the Western Sahara today, especially during the monsoon seasons. Okay, and very large inland bodies of water sometimes are even called seas, okay? Mainly due to their size. And so, as you can see here, the Eye of the Sahara, or the Richat structure itself, is a local minimum in elevation, and it's surrounded by areas of higher elevation. And so this would be a form of lake or a large sea, considering how big it is. And there would also be a large sea over the mountains from the Richat structure as well. Now, interestingly, even in the middle of Mauritania, there actually is an intermittent lake, which is sort of like a muddy period where all the moisture accumulates at the bottom of the Richat structure today. However, as you can see with the elevation lines, if this were to completely fill up during a monsoon season, or just maybe over the course of hundreds and thousands of years, then the water level would get as high as around 400 meters or 410 meters, or about there. And once it got to that level, it would basically have to start a river, because at that point there would be areas of lower elevation. Now, another interesting thing we see here is that there are these deposits of salt at the lowest elevation in these structures. And so this also suggests that there was water in these areas before that accumulated the salt and then put it in that location. Again, this doesn't have to be salt from the ocean, okay, because there's rocks that have salt that can come up through geological processes. This just means there was water here. It was likely fresh water, and it could have been fresh water. Okay, and you also see tons of water erosion features around these mountains as well, obviously, because we know that this has long periods of both being very dry and being very wet. Okay, now if you look at the Richat structure itself, it's around 30 kilometers across. And so when we overlay this on the Dead Sea, you can see that's very large. And if you're standing within the Richat structure at a distance of 3 kilometers or 3 miles, that's where the horizon would start. Okay, so this really would look like a sea in that time, just with fresh water. Okay, now moving on, we get into even some more interesting details that resemble the Richat structure. So this is talking about the mortal woman that Poseidon fell in love with, and he says this: Poseidon fell in love with her and had intercourse with her, and breaking the ground, enclosed the hill in which she dwelt all around, making alternate zones of sea and land, larger and smaller, encircling one another. There were 2 of land and 3 of water, which he turned as with a lathe, each having its circumference equidistant every way from the center, so that no man could get to the island, for ships and voyages were not as yet. And so this is really interesting, because if we imagine the Richat structure, or if we just look at the elevation map where the Richat structure would be full of water, there would be regions that would be complete rings of water where there would be no land bridge to cross into the center, where that little mountain would be in the center there. And you can also see there's basically 2 large rings of land that would be complete rings, and then 3 main rings of water. Okay? And there's also a little tiny ring around the main island, but he actually explains this as well. So really there's 3 rings of land as well and 4 rings of water, but he explains this fully. Now here he says, he himself, being a god, found no difficulty in making special arrangements for the center of the island, bringing up 2 springs of water from beneath the earth, one of warm water and the other of cold, and making every variety of food to spring up abundantly from the soil. Okay, so this is basically saying that there should be spring or something like that in the center of the Richat structure, at least during the humid periods. Okay, and apparently, according to ChatGPT, there's no strong evidence of hydrothermal activity, so this would be like a geyser or a very hot water within the last couple thousand years, but there is over long periods of time because, of course, the Richat structure is supposed to be a collapsed lava dome. Okay, so not likely that there was a hot water geyser, but actually somewhat possible. Okay, and when it comes to the springs, there are no active springs in the region, but the water table is also much lower than we'd expect as during the Green Sahara period. And based on the type of rocks and other things like this, most people conclude that it's possible that it did have springs at that time. Now, like I said earlier, the continent or the island of Atlantis was divided into 10 different regions, and he gave the central plain and the concentric rings city that he continues to describe to his first son Atlas. But now he's going to describe the other lands of Atlantis and how Poseidon distributed it. Okay, here he says, he named Atlas, and after him the whole island and the ocean were called Atlantic. Okay, so this is more evidence that Atlantis is in the Atlantic Ocean, or at least borders it, and not in some other region of the world like Asia. Now continuing, to his twin brother, who was born after him, and obtained as his lot the extremity of the island towards the Pillars of Heracles, facing the country, which is now called the region of Gades in that part of the world. Now, Gades, this is widely known, is talking about Cadiz, or what's known as modern day Spain. Okay, now if you consider where the ancient Greeks thought Libya or North Africa ended, you can see how Atlantis, if it's considered just West Africa, would still have an extremity that would be pointing towards Cadiz. And this could even extend to all the way into Morocco, because again, this is described by the ancient Egyptians. Now here he's talking about all the other sons that he has with this mortal woman. Okay, so here he says, dividing the island of Atlantis into 10 portions, he gave to the firstborn of the eldest pair his mother's dwelling and the surrounding allotment. Again, talking about the mountain and the concentric rings and the plain, which was the largest and best, and made him king over the rest. The others he made princes, and they gave them rule over many men in a large territory, and he named them all. Okay, and here he goes into all the names, which are not super relevant, but at the bottom he says this. All these and their descendants for many generations were the inhabitants and rulers of divers islands in the open sea. And also, as has been already said, they held sway in our direction over the country within the pillars as far as Egypt and Tyrrhenia. Now, as for divers islands, we can see that there's many islands off the coast of West Africa, and so this is entirely matching the rest of the story completely. When it comes to Tyrrhenia, this is essentially a part of Italy, okay? And then obviously Egypt, and so as far as the areas of sway, they're both around the same distance from the mythological area of Atlantis, okay? Or at least the center of Atlantis. Now continuing, here's just an interesting little bit. They said, in the first place, they dug out of the earth whatever was to be found there, solid as well as fusile, and that which is now only a name, and was then something more than a name, or a calcum, was dug out of the earth in many parts of the island, being more precious in those days than anything except gold. Now here, Critias is sort of explaining that They at least don't call it orichalcum, or they don't have this in ancient Greece. But basically, this is considered some form of brass and sort of like fake gold kind of thing that is obviously common, not just in this story, but throughout ancient times. Now, continuing, this is describing Atlantis, especially the center of it. Critias says, there was an abundance of wood for carpenter's work and sufficient maintenance for tame and wild animals. Moreover, there were a great number of elephants in the island, for as there was provision for all other sorts of animals, both for those which live in lakes and marshes and rivers, and also for those which live in mountains and on plains, so there was for the animal, which is the largest and most voracious of all. Here you can see the habitat of elephants, and we'd expect this to be talking about African elephants, which were the only ones that the ancient Greeks were familiar with at the time. But you can see some of the habitat actually extends into Western Africa, and of course, the Green Sahara would extend that habitat significantly, because most of the Sahara would be a savanna where the elephants would be able to thrive very well. But again, this is another piece of evidence against Atlantis being in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, where most people consider it impossible for elephants to live within the last 20,000 years, say. And even Madagascar, you can see, doesn't have any elephants on it as well. So for people who think Madagascar is Atlantis, same thing. Same thing for people who think Santorini or anything in the Mediterranean is Atlantis. It simply would not have elephants. Now, as far as evidence of elephants, like I said in the Green Sahara video, there's evidence of these sort of herding communities with cattle and all sorts of other animals, and then even evidence of giraffes, and of course they found elephant bones and things like this. Okay, now moving on. I'm not going to read through this entire section, but here he's basically describing that there was very abundant food and drinks in Atlantis, and he's also describing a lot of extravagant man-made buildings like harbors and temples and palaces and whatnot. And this is something that we'll not find any evidence for, as we'll get into later. But as far as the natural features, they are strikingly similar. Okay, and here you can see they mention that there are zones of sea or zones of water that are surrounding this city, and that they apparently built roads in between and things like this. Okay, now here he gets into more specifics that we can actually compare to the Richat structure. Okay, so first off, they say, and beginning from the sea, they bored a canal of 300 feet in width and 100 feet in depth and 50 stadia in length, which they carried through to the outermost zone, making a passage from the sea up to this, which became a harbor. And you can see there is basically through the largest zone, or through the fully connected zone, through both fully connected zones, there are basically regions at about 100 feet of depth or more, that you could expect water to pass through, and that we actually see water erosion in. Okay? And the length of these, basically from the inner water circle all the way out to the outer water circle, is actually almost exactly 50 stadia as well. So this matches up pretty much perfectly. Now, they also say the banks were raised considerably above the water. And as you can see on the elevation map, this is absolutely true. And if we consider that the water would be at around 410 meters or 400 meters, and possibly slightly more for the inside ring at certain times, even at the highest water level imaginable, you still have up to a 90-meter elevation difference. So that's going to be a very, very steep bank. Okay, now here we're getting into even more specifics with the measurements. And as you can see, they'll pretty much all match up perfectly to the Richat structure. Okay, now on the outside, we have what can be considered the largest zone. And this is going to be mostly impassable, but you can see there actually are some low elevation regions that you'd probably be able to pass through on the south, potentially. And we measure the thickness of this. It's 3 stadia, like it's described as in the Critias. Okay, the next one is the zone of land which came next. So the next zone in. And he also describes this as being 3 stadia in breadth as well. And when we measure this one, again, this depends where you measure it from. But measuring from bank to bank, this is also pretty much exactly 3 stadia as well. just like it says in the Critias. Okay, now again, they also mentioned this canal, and they also said that it could fit one ship through, which is pretty interesting. And you can see here that there's no passage to the south of this second ring, and so you would have to go through this one canal at the top. Otherwise, it's totally impossible because the water level can't get any higher than around 410 meters. Okay, now when you look at the canal, you can see that it would probably just barely be low enough that the water would pass through. And of course, eventually, at some point, if the water level got too high in one ring, it would eventually pass out through this canal. And you can see it's around the size that that was mentioned in the Critias as well. Now here it gets really interesting. He says, but the next two zones, the one of water, the other of land, were 2 stadia, and the one which surrounded the central island was a stadium only in width. Now, these two smaller zones are not completely consistent around the center of the Richat structure and the little mountain in the center. However, this small circle that does go around the main island is pretty much exactly 1 stadium in width as well. So you can see here, just measuring it, it's about 200 meters bank to bank. And so this is basically exactly how it's described. And again, you can find certain parts of the other two little inner rings there that are also 2 stadia, just like it's described. But again, it sort of depends on where you measure. Okay, and this is all, an oral tradition. Okay, so the fact that they're this close and at least on the same order of magnitude is already really remarkable. Okay. Now here he says the island in which the palace was situated had a diameter of 5 stadia. Okay, so this is the island in the center. And now when you just measure it normally, it's around 1,800 meters. So this would be more like 7 or 8 or 9 stadia. But if you could assume the water levels were maybe a little bit higher, or at their the maximum water level, then it is pretty much exactly 5 stadia at around 1,000 meters. Okay. Now continuing on, this is another really important detail that matches up perfectly with the surrounding area of the Richat structure. So it says here, the stone which was used in the work they quarried from underneath the center island and from underneath the zones on the outer as well as the inner side. One kind was white, another black, and a third red. And as they quarried, they at the same time hollowed out double docks, having roof formed out of the native rock. Some of their buildings were simple, but in others they put together different stones, varying the color to please the eye and to be a natural source of delight. Now, to me, varying the stones actually doesn't sound much more complicated. That still sounds pretty simple. And when you look at the surrounding structures that we have even today, they're remarkably similar and the rocks are the same color. So very close to the Richat structure, we have this little town. I'm not sure exactly what people do there. I guess there's just a little bit of water, and it's pretty much deserted also when you go into Street View. But let's go take a look and see what the buildings look like there. Okay, so as you can see here, pretty much all the rocks are either black or gray and white and red. And so on this wall, it's mostly red. When you look over here, you can see a lot of the white and dark and red stones. Okay, I also found this really random donkey that was just tied up to one of these walls here. And yeah, it's interesting how this little village is very similar to what they describe in Critias. And I'm not sure exactly when this entire village was built, but you can see it has modern doors on it. So you can expect this is actually sort of contemporary. And maybe it's possible that the original village was built a long time ago, but probably not thousands of years, obviously. But maybe the stones were reused. Okay, but again, the buildings are described as mostly simple, or where the colors of the stones were changing, which kind of conflicts with the mythological description that is given by the Greek authors of all the gold and brass being put on everything in the very advanced palaces. Okay, which is an interesting fact. Okay, now here's another one of these sort of mythological sounding things. They say the entire circuit of the wall, which went round the outermost zone, they covered with a coating of brass, and the circuit of the next wall they coated with tin, and the third, which encompassed the citadel, flashed with the red light of orichalcum. Okay, now one could make the argument that all of the gold and orichalcum and whatnot was looted over thousands of years, kind of like the Great Pyramid, where that was left was rubble. However, I don't exactly subscribe to this theory, and it's just that we would expect to find at least a little bit of evidence. Like, for example, in the Great Pyramid, they found tons of evidence. And actually, they don't mention any sort of megalithic structures in this story either, so we shouldn't expect any of those. However, as you'll see later in the video, there's only a tiny, tiny bit of evidence of any sort of civilization similar to the dynastic Egyptians. It sounds much more like, the evidence looks more like just primitive civilizations similar to Göbekli Tepe or even more primitive. But it's still up for debate, and really, this is the middle of the Sahara Desert, and the amount of archaeology hasn't been fully fleshed out. Okay, and so here's even more description of the extravagant gold and orichalcum and silver surroundings of these so-called palaces that they had. And again, we don't really have any leftover evidence of any palaces similar to what we saw in ancient Greece, and of course anything similar to ancient Egyptian giant granite-based palaces. Okay, and here again they mention the fountains or springs of water. So they said in the next place they had found fountains, one of cold and another of hot water, and gracious plenty flowing. Okay, so again that's another question of springs. So maybe someone should do a analysis in a scientific paper of trying to calculate whether or not the rocks in the Richat structure would produce springs. And especially over long periods of time, like 5,000 years ago, if there was any chance of the water being warm because of possible volcanic type activity deep underground. Okay, and here's just going back to what we said earlier, how it's possible that they had springs, but not confirmed in any way. Okay, here's just another little interesting fact. They keep talking about the city of Atlantis, and here I thought it was interesting. They said a race course of a stadium in width and in length allowed to extend all around the island. Okay, so I think this is the outer zone, which is very large, and so I just thought that's a cool little detail that they had there. And we could see in the elevation map that those outer zones would have been fully connected. So something like this would be possible, although it's not clear that they had horses in the Green Sahara at that time. Okay, and then also they said that the docks were full of triremes and naval stores. So this is sort of suggesting that they had boats or things like this. And again, maybe if there was a river, or even if maybe there wasn't a river, it's such a large sea and such a large lake that it would make sense to have boats of some kind. And even sort of primitive ones, but here they're described as more of a modern kind of boats. But this could be a translation issue as well. Okay, now here's another fact that perfectly matches up with the Richat structure. Again, another just impossible coincidence. So they say, leaving the palace and passing out across the 3 harbors, you came to a wall which began at the sea and went all around. This was everywhere distant 50 stadia from the largest zone or harbor, and enclosed the whole, the ends meeting at the mouth of the channel which led to the sea. Okay, so it's interesting, number one, that they say the channel that's leading to the sea. So it's implying that the Richat structure city, or I should just call it the concentric circle city, is not actually the sea. It's just that it has a channel that leading to the actual sea. Okay, and it does say that this is in the center of the island or the continent. So I really shouldn't be surprised by this. Okay, now if we measure, let's see, what was it, 50 stadia? Yeah, so if we measure from the outermost ring out to the wall or the mountains, And when you can see on the elevation map, it's actually a very steep decline. That would be considered a wall. And you'll especially see it when you look at a picture of the mountains, as we will later. But you can see it's pretty much 10 kilometers or 50 stadia all the way around. And you can see here 10 kilometers, and here it is, on this side it's actually closer to 70 kilometers, although that side doesn't actually have mountains, so I actually shouldn't have included that. However, there is sort of a little hill on that side. Okay, now as far as the channel that led to the sea, we can see some sort of water erosion that looks like some sort of ancient river from thousands of years ago. And we do have basically a path of elevation that you can see that the water would flow. And it might have some lakes along the way. But you can see basically there's a pretty consistent path that the water would follow if the Richat structure filled up with water, which again we would expect during the African Humid Period. Okay, now here he's saying he's done describing the city, and now he's going to describe the plain. So he says, nearly in the words of Solon, and now I must endeavor to represent to you the nature and arrangement of the rest of the land. The whole country was said by him to be very lofty and precipitous on the side of the sea, but the country immediately about and surrounding the city was a level plain, itself surrounded by mountains which descended towards the sea. It was smooth and even and of an oblong shape, extending in one direction 3,000 stadia, but across the center inland it was 2,000 stadia. This part of the island, so this is just part of the greater Atlantis, looked towards the south and was sheltered from the north. Okay, sort of implying mountains in the north. The surrounding mountains were celebrated for their number and size and beauty, far beyond any which still exist, having in them also many wealthy villages of country folk and rivers and lakes and meadows. Okay, so we're going to go through each one of these points line by line, and you'll see they all perfectly match the surrounding area of the Richat structure. So first of all, they'll point about the entire, presumably the entire island, but maybe just the surrounding area. He says is lofty and precipitous on the side of the sea. So this basically just means it's another way of saying it's steep. It's also interesting that he says on the side of the sea, as if there was only one side towards the sea. Again, on an island, you'd expect it to be surrounded by the sea on all sides. But in this case, Critias says on the side of the sea, implying that there's only one side of the sea. Okay, and if we look at the Western Sahara, the only sea is to the west. Okay, so this is interesting. Also, the mountains are going down in that direction. And there's actually a group of smaller mountains towards the bottom of the plain you can see there as well. Okay, now as far as it being a level plain, you can see on the elevation map, it's a very gradual, steady elevation on that entire region south of the Richat structure. And we can basically expect that to be a plain during the Green Sahara, where today it's just a desert. So maybe savanna might be more accurate. Okay? And again, surrounded by mountains which descended towards the sea, and you have the mountains on the south too. And you also have these little lakes on the south, but I'll get into that later. Okay? Now, here's an example from this video you should check out. This guy actually went and visited the Richat structure, and he's a big fan of the Richat structure theory, and he's actually part of a follower of the bright insight theory, which is that a giant tsunami or a giant great flood went over the entire Sahara Desert, which if you watch my Green Sahara video, you know I disagree with that point. And as you're watching this video, you see it's totally unnecessary because Atlantis is the size of a continent. Okay, it says it right there in the story. Okay, it says it's greater than Libya and Asia. Okay. Okay, and here's another elevation map. So you can see it's smooth and even and of an oblong shape. And so it basically says it's a rectangular or oblong, which means like kind of oval shaped. And you can see it's basically the shape of it. Okay, now this part, the dimensions simply are just perfect. They just match up perfectly. Okay, in one direction, 3,000 stadia. So that would be 600 kilometers if you're using 200-meter stadia. Okay, that's really, really close. And in this one, 2,000 stadia, so 370. That's also very close to 400. Again, sometimes a stadia is like 180 or 150. So these match up absolutely perfectly. Okay, and then as far as it being sheltered from the north, we have the mountain range surrounding the Richat structure, which is to the north. Okay, now it says the surrounding mountains were celebrated for their number and size and beauty. Okay, so there's a bunch of mountains above the Richat structure, far beyond any which still exist. And it says they have many wealthy villages, so it's a very large area, makes sense, and rivers and lakes and meadows. Now, as far as rivers and lakes, we can see the water erosion patterns and the little divots all over the place. So obviously, if it was a heavy rainfall period, that one seems pretty obvious. And again, this is a huge region. It sort of looks small in this shot, but these are like, you can see right in the middle there, that's like a 20, 30 kilometer meadow, you could call it, or just a plain, okay, at the top of the mountain. Okay, so this pretty much perfectly matches up as well. Oh, another point. As far as the giant surrounding mountains for Atlantis, this is another point of why Atlantis is not some tiny island in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, because the sea levels have only risen 60 meters since Atlantis. And so we would see those islands. We would know, I mean, we would see Atlantis if it was in the middle of the ocean, and it's mostly empty. Okay. There's no continent in the middle of the Atlantic. It's just in the Africa part of the Atlantic. Okay, now here's getting more into the plain. Here he's describing what he calls a circular ditch, okay, that goes around the entire plain, which is really interesting. And this also gives another dimension to the plain that we can compare, okay? So here he says, the depth and width and length of this ditch were incredible and gave the impression that a work of such extent, in addition to so many others, could never have been artificial. So this is kind of a hilarious point that Critias is saying here. And this is sort of a Greek mythology ethic in how he's talking. He's saying it could never have been artificial. Basically, yeah, this makes the Panama Canal look like a joke for these dimensions. And so does artificially creating the Richat structure. Okay, it's not really possible, and he kind of knows this, as you can see in his commentary. Okay, continuing. And that's why I think it's a natural feature, or sort of a natural wonder, versus an actual city. Okay, continuing. Nevertheless, I must say what I was told. So he's like skeptical of this. Again, this is something, like I was saying earlier, why would Plato make up something like this? It just doesn't make any sense. It just must have had to come from the Egyptian priests based on the reaction that these Greek guys are having to this. Okay? Now he says, it was excavated to the depth of 100 feet, and its breadth was a stadium everywhere. Okay, so its breadth was 200 meters. It's basically a river, 100 feet deep. That's actually a pretty deep river. And then 200 meters across. That's basically just like a large river. Okay, it was carried around the whole of the plain and was 10,000 stadia in length. It received the streams which came down from the mountains, and winding round the plain and meeting at the city, was there let off into the sea. Okay, and we'll get into the next part later. Okay, he also describes the size of Atlantis, the size of the central plain in terms of the area. Okay, and we'll get into that as well. Okay, now getting into the circular ditch idea, as far as this region, we know there's these giant lakes, and when you follow along the south and along the west, and when you look at the elevation lines, and you basically just draw rivers along the low elevations where you'd expect the rivers to form, you could see that it matches the shape of the plain. And obviously this is sort of just naturally a flat plain like this wouldn't form in a region that had rivers going through it. Okay, it's very steady when you look at the elevation map of the plain. So there could be rivers going through it, and they actually said that there's channels going through the plain. But basically, the big rivers are going to be on the outside of the plain where the elevation is low and converges. Now, measuring. Okay, so 2,000 kilometers, that is 10,000 stadia exactly. And so again, this is another measurement that exactly matches the description in Critias as far as the center part of Western Africa being Atlantis. Actually, no, sorry. The entire Western Africa being Atlantis, and the Eye of the Sahara being at the center. And this plain is at the center as well. Now, here it says, it was excavated to the depth of 100 feet, and its breadth was 100 its breadth was a stadium everywhere. It was carried around the whole of the plain and was 10,000 stadia in length. It received the streams which came down from the mountains, and winding around the plain and meeting at the city, was there led off into the sea. Okay, so it's winding around this plain, and then it gets to the city, which the city is in the center of the island, which is the size of a continent, and there it was led off into the sea. Okay, so the only way this would work is if it was led off to the sea through a river. Okay, so you really need to pay attention to the details of the words in this story, or else you just start assuming that everything is described as being right next to the ocean, just because it's called, certain things are called sea within the city. Okay, now here they say the size of a lot was a square of 10 stadia each way, and the total number of all the lots was 60,000. Okay, now doing the math, this works out to 240,000 square kilometers, and the radius of that would be 276 kilometers. And so it's a circle of this big. Now I plotted that on this plane here, and you can see the area in the circle and the area in the plane is pretty much the same. Okay, it's actually maybe a little bit off, but close enough. And they weren't actually, they weren't so great at math as we are today. So cut them some slack. Okay. Now, let's see. Oh, but yeah, and the order of magnitude, the order is completely perfect. This is still essentially a perfect number. Okay, now there's a further inland, blah, 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 100 feet in width were cut from it through the plain and again let into the ditch leading into the sea. Okay, so that's talking about actually, this is a kind of a confusing bit. I'm not sure if this is talking about going into the city or within the plain, but most of the context in this paragraph is talking about the city. Okay, now it says, these canals were at intervals of 100 stadia, and by them they brought down the wood from the mountains to the city and conveyed the fruits of the earth in ships, cutting transverse passages from one canal into another and to the city. Okay, so from the water erosion lines, you can see in character, this is totally correct. They cut transverse paths and they connect and they go down to the city, which is the concentric circles of the Richat structure, and the water. Okay, and obviously it's sort of obvious that there's a giant lake here just by looking at these erosion patterns. Okay, now let's see here. Oh yeah, as far as doing the measurements, now if you look at all these different channels and rivers that are going down, obviously they're not artificial. These are obviously natural. And you wouldn't really need to make artificial channels either, just frankly. But you can find parts of these rivers that are the correct dimensions, but again, and some that are the correct distance apart. But again, it's not clear where you should measure them. So these dimensions being perfectly correct doesn't really matter. It's more just the description of this is exactly correct as far as mountains surrounding the concentric circle structure, which is a lake in the center of a continent. And yeah, it just works out pretty much perfectly. Now, here they talk about, basically something like seasonal weather patterns. Okay, so I'm just going to read it. They say, twice in the year, they gather the fruits of the earth. In winter, having the benefit of the rains of heaven, and in summer, the water which the land supplied by introducing the streams from the canals. Now, it's interesting that they say in winter, having the benefit of the rains of heaven, because we'd expect the monsoon to be in the summertime. Okay, however, the way that monsoons work is a little bit more complicated than that. Okay, now there's also this paper that I found online that says early Holocene greening of the Sahara requires Mediterranean winter rainfall. Okay, so if this paper is true, then you would have this Mediterranean rain in the winter going over the the northern part of the Sahara, and then you would have the monsoon in the summer. You'd have the monsoon in the summer, which would provide the rain in the summer. That said, was introduced by streams, but obviously it has to rain for the streams to get the water. Okay, so it's raining in both the summer and the winter. I also talked to ChatGPT about monsoons, and there's actually this phenomenon of the summer monsoon, which usually is much more rainfall. But then in the winter monsoon, even in the northern hemisphere, you will get some rainfall in certain areas. And it's interesting because in the spring and fall, the transitional periods, these periods get less rainfall than the so-called dry season of the winter. Okay, and now, surprisingly, we are reaching the end of the story, where the descriptions of the geography of Atlantis are totally finished. Okay, so in this giant paragraph, I'm not going to read the entire thing, but again, you can go through it for yourself. And the point is here is that the people of Atlantis, for a long period of time, were a very virtuous and prosperous people. Okay, and that's the best way I can summarize this giant page of text. Now here's the final paragraph, which I'm going to be reading in its entirety, just for fun. By such reflections, and by the continuance in them of a divine nature, the qualities which we have described grew and increased among them. But when the divine portion began to fade away, and became diluted too often and too much with the mortal admixture, and the human nature got the upper hand, they then, being unable to bear their fortune, behaved unseemly, and to him who had an eye to see grew visibly debased, for they were losing the fairest of their precious gifts. But to those who had no eye to see the true happiness, they appeared glorious and blessed at the very time when they were full of avarice and unrighteous power. Zeus, the god of gods, who rules according to law, and is able to see into such things, perceiving that an honorable race was in woeful plight, and wanting to inflict punishment on them, that they might be chastened and improve, collected all the gods into their most holy habitation, which, being placed in the center of the world, beholds all created things. And when he had called them together, he spake as follows. And this is where the rest of the dialogue of the Critias has been lost. Okay, so this is a really interesting fact, that the end of Critias is basically missing as far as the story. And so all that we have is Solon's description of Atlantis, and then a really short version of the war. We really don't know what happens in the actual story. Now, my headcanon for this is that either, number one, this was part of Solon's poem, and he never actually got around to writing the part down that he had to invent. He just wrote down the part that was told to him by the ancient priests. Okay? And then kind of mixed that in with a little bit of influence with the Greek gods. The other idea is that, again, this is all just stuff I'm making up, no evidence for this, is that the same thing, but done with Plato. Okay, so Critias had told him, or others, the story of Atlantis as told to him by Solon and through Solon's poem. And then Plato is planning on continuing this and turning this into his own poem or his own dialogue, but he never got around to it. Okay, so those are likely things. But again, it's also possible that it just went missing and that either Solon finished it or the Egyptian priests actually had this myth of Athens versus Atlantis, which seems unlikely to me, actually. It doesn't make sense for the Egyptians to have a myth about Greece and Atlantis. And so I think it's going to happen at Solon. It's either he didn't finish it or that part of the story went missing. Okay, so my conclusion is that the geography of Atlantis is real and based on the Western Sahara and Richat structure, but now we need to answer the question of, was there an advanced civilization, and was the mythological sounding part of the story with Poseidon and the palace and the city, was that true, and was there an advanced civilization at Atlantis? Well, unfortunately, the only evidence that we have, and this isn't very much evidence at all, is this tiny piece of polished granite. Okay, so this guy, Archaic Lens, I think I already talked about him earlier in the video, but he went and visit, and some people found a tiny piece of granite, and it looks like a little handle from something from the dynastic Egyptians. Okay, however, again, this could just be visitors from Egypt who visited much later and left this tiny piece of granite behind. It's not exactly evidence of a lost ancient civilization. Okay, and here's more of what they're finding. They're mostly finding sort of Neolithic stuff like rocks and spearheads and whatnot and stuff like this. Okay, and then I didn't watch this whole video, but you could go watch this one too. It's called The Actual Archaeology of the Richat. And they basically, I only watched like 10 minutes of it, but they're basically talking about a pretty vast human civilization as far as primitive hunter-gatherers and herder-type civilizations I shouldn't call them civilizations, but groups of people. And these guys are actually very, you could call them very mainstream and kind of debunking type of people. Okay, and even they accept that there's all of these evidence of early humans through the African Humid Period all over the Richat structure. And they even show a map showing all the different evidence of humans that's been found at the Richat. Okay, so there's really no obvious evidence for a advanced civilization at the Richat structure. However, I will say the deepest parts of the Richat structure are probably covered in sand, and they haven't been fully excavated. And so it's still possible that we could find some pretty advanced human technology down there. But you would have to expect this to be less advanced than the Old Kingdom in Egypt. And I would actually, if they do find anything, I would estimate that from that time period that it would look like Göbekli Tepe, which was also 11,000 years ago. And so maybe some very primitive early farming and herding and hunting and this kind of thing. But then again, they could have evidence of building the houses that Critias talked about. And it could actually come really close to the Atlantis story. Now, as far as were they smelting metals, yeah, I would be skeptical of that. But again, it's possible. We'll have to see. I think once people understand that this was truly Atlantis, there could be some more archaeology. Okay, but I'm not expecting any advanced civilization on the order of what was described in the story. Okay, I think there was a little bit of exaggeration by Solon and the other Greek guys who played that game of telephone. Okay. Oh, and by the way, a bit of cope that people have with this problem is that they say that that a great flood wiped out all the evidence of any advanced human civilization. The problem with that is that we have documented evidence of all these spearheads and all this, basic human items that existed presumably before Atlantis and on the order of like 15,000 years ago, okay, which is very, very basic rocks and things like this. Okay, so before and after kind of thing. And so this point doesn't make sense, or else you wouldn't find any human evidence left over from before, say, 11,000 years ago. Okay, now in addition to this, I also made an entire video talking about the Green Sahara and how it actually formed based on my opinion of the science. And I also disagreed, based on the basic evidence of erosion, that it wasn't caused by a great flood. So you can go check out that video as well. And I'll put the link to that video in the description. So guys, after doing tons and tons of research and keeping an open mind, I can really only conclude that Atlantis' story is talking about the Western Sahara, the Richat structure, and the surrounding plain. It's really the only thing that makes sense to me. And I also disagree that there was a much more advanced civilization in that location. Okay, I think it's just a mythological way for the predecessors of the ancient Egyptians to have an oral tradition and to remember their homeland. And again, it's probably more advanced than the mainstream thinks, for sure. However, this is just the conclusion I've come to. Okay, so let me know what you guys think. If you got to this point in the video and you still disagree with me, or you think Atlantis is still made up, or maybe you think Atlantis is somewhere else, make sure to let me know. And especially if you've watched through all the evidence that I've presented in this video, and let me know if I've made any mistakes. But with that being said, thanks for watching. Big shout out to Bright Insight, which is kind of how I got interested in this topic. And yeah, he does have some incorrect ideas when it comes to the Great Flood and whatnot, but I think most of the ideas in his videos are on the right track, I would say. And of course, it's really incredible. You have to be grateful for people like Solon and Plato, rest in peace. And they really would have loved to see this being revealed today in 2025 with tools like Google Maps and elevation maps. And we're finally solving this mystery that's been eluding us for 3,000 years. So I think it's really incredible. And I really hope that this sparks a greater interest in archaeology in the Sahara okay, especially the Richat structure, and especially the regions surrounding Egypt that are now the Sahara Desert and that are buried in sand, and which obviously haven't been excavated. And because there's a whole ton of other things I can make videos on, of things that even Herodotus described that are totally lost now, like the labyrinth and other monuments like this in ancient Egypt that we still haven't discovered. So I really hope this video inspires people to do some archaeology out in the Sahara Desert, and maybe one of you will even be the ones to discover some giant revelation at the site of Atlantis. So with that being said, thanks so much for watching. Make sure to subscribe and like and share. And this channel is mostly going to be space content and science content, but again, I'll be doing tons of other deep dives and like this on random topics and even ancient history once in a while. So make sure to subscribe if you're interested in that. And with that being said, thanks so much for watching and have a great day.